What is up, my cutouts? Cardboard Ninja here, coming at you with the updated tier list for all the weapons in Crossout, including the newest ones that were released in the Chase Pass. So we're just gonna get right to that right away. We've got the Am5 Avalanche. For those of us who do not know, this is an extremely powerful weapon. It uses 12 energy. This is similar to the Kaiju, in that it uses 12 energy. The weapon is extraordinarily heavy at somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1,500 kilograms, so on and so forth, and it deals a walloping 700 damage per hit. However, that's only on direct hit. The damage is split between direct bullet damage and blast damage, and the bullet damage component of the Avalanche is 500. The splash damage component is 200. The interesting thing about the Avalanche that I've found is the blast damage is wonky. You miss your target and land near it, the blast radius seems larger. If you hit your target directly, the blast radius seems low. Based on a whole bunch of testing, the blast radius on the Avalanche should theoretically, or could theoretically, extend past 13 pins. However, when in practice, it is very difficult to demonstrate this. I've set up many tests. There's going to be a video on that later on how wonky the Avalanche's blast radius is. But for this purpose of the tier list, how does it rank up against, well, the current weapons on the list? The Avalanche hits unbelievably hard. It is pretty dang solid. It can be dragged into multiple power scores, and it's actually a force to behold. It's really quite annoying, especially when utilized with the Omamori or its predecessor, the Averter. Pretty good weapon. It does hit unbelievably hard. It's got its problems, though. Everyone currently that's running around in Crossout with the Avalanche is using the fused Avalanche, because everyone who got the Battle Pass has a fused version. The fused version has increased blast radius, which is irrelevant, but it also has increased bullet velocity of 25%. The base Avalanche, with 25% slower projectile, would mean that the range on the Avalanche is unbelievably low. Projectile speed is pretty dang slow, and pretty much reduces this to a point blank only range weapon. But with that said, there are other weapons that exist that do very similar things, such as the Lancelot, which are absolutely point blank range only weapons, or mini pyre builds that attempt to blast people at point blank range using the dust cabin. So where does this rank? The Avalanche probably is going to land right around in B tier. It's solid, it does work, it works in a bevy of power scores, but it limits the way that you have to build your vehicle in many ways, because it is very large. It's turreted, and well, there's not much more to say about that. It's very difficult to build with the Avalanche. Almost every single Avalanche build that you will see will be the same. It's just the Avalanche sitting on the front, right in front of the cabin, and good luck. I myself have my own build version of this. It works just fine. But yeah, we're going to go with B tier for right now. A good weapon, very powerful, unbelievably annoying. It's very good at getting hit those hard to reach back teeth. But yeah, interesting stuff. Next up we have is the Tempest. I warned everyone that this would be an autocannon because of the fact that it follows all of the standard autocannon properties, and it does. It is no better, no worse than the AC-50 Storm. Theoretically worse, because it is very precise over distance. The problem is that even though it's very precise over distance, unlike its antecedent, the Whirl, which is actually very bad over distance, the problem is it doesn't have a bonus, doesn't have a perk at all. Similar to, I mean, one, it doesn't have a perk at all, but two, it's dissimilar from the AC-50 Storm and the Whirl. Whirlwind? I think it's the, yeah, and the Whirlwind. Because the AC-50 Storm and the Whirlwind each have a perk that increases damage the further away the target is. Tempest has no perk at all. It just has bullet drop-off, or damage drop-off. So because of that, even though it's more accurate at long distances than other autocannons of its ilk, there's no incentive to using it at that distance. And it has no perk or any rapid fire rate for close range combat either. So Tempest is an okay gun, but there are significantly better weapons out there. It's the weakest weapon released in the Battle Pass. We're going to drop into C. Next up, we have the Miller. The Miller is a minigun. Minigun very similar to the Reaper. And as we all know, the Reaper is currently placed into C tier. Originally, when released, the Miller did the exact same damage per bullet as the Reaper, but at 2/3 the fire rate. the Miller has a perk that says every 16th shot, or sorry, after 15 consecutive shots that are on target, you get a projectile that is high explosive. Originally, the high explosive projectile did 83 damage and had like a 1.5 pin blast radius and had almost no impulse. At that point in time, the Miller did just fine. Its DPS when compared to a Reaper was only about 2/3, even if you landed 100% of your shots. But the reason why the Miller is compares favorably against the Reaper for one simple reason: power score. The Miller is not a legendary weapon; it is an epic weapon. And then, in addition to it not being a legendary weapon and yet an epic weapon, it has lower energy cost. Lower energy cost combined with lower rarity means that the power score for the Miller is almost half the Reaper. It is barely over 1/2 the Reaper, but it gives you 2/3 the damage of the Reaper. It's great. That was before they changed it twice. The first change reduced the damage of the Miller by 2 per shot and increased the blast damage from 83 to 102, something like that, and dramatically increased the impulse of the blast. Effectively, every time the blast shot came out from the Miller's perk, it was the equivalent of hitting them with the spike. That was insane. And for that brief period in time, the Miller became unbelievably obscene. They have since reduced the blast impulse by 20%. And after all of those changes, it's still good. The Miller is very, very good. Is it A tier or is it B tier is basically the question that I'm left with. It was definitely A tier before they brought the impulse back down. And after they brought the impulse back down, leaving the damage lower than it was, I'm still leaning towards A tier. The Miller seems to be very, very, very good at what it does in the power scores that is brought to. But not necessarily too far outside of those. So actually, no. Based on that, it's got to be B tier. Sorry about that. It's got to be B tier. Because whenever it's brought to a specific power score band, it will function. No, wait. No, actually. Dang it. Sorry to go back and forth. That is actually the definition of A tier. I'm sorry. In any power score band it's brought to, it will perform. So there's a difference between that and it being limited to specific power score brackets. Though you shouldn't take the Miller too high, and it is very difficult to use the Miller with 3 Millers, which you can do. The only viable 3 Miller builds are, of course, with the favorite cabin, because the Miller does overheat, and that would be, 3 Millers and an RN seal on the favorite, in order to try and get maximum DPS. But the Miller seems to apex out at 2 Millers on a build, and it does very well. It does very well for itself. Only because of the fact that its power score is less than half of the thing that comes after it. And, well, not less than, but just barely more than half of the weapon that comes right after it. So that's the number one problem with the Reaper. The Reaper still falls into that category of painful to use because of the fact that its power score is just too damn high. It just takes too much power score to use the Reaper, because it's fighting against things that it's not good against. Whereas the Miller, which does less damage, has almost the exact same parameters as the Reaper: slow turret traverse, bullet velocity, all that stuff. The reason why the Miller actually keeps up is because it's against builds that aren't super mega chonkers. They're not against your 13k power score builds. So Miller, A tier. Sorry about that waffling. All right. Next up is the Ra1 Heather. Oh my goodness. So Ra1 Heather is the second artillery piece in the game. I predicted that it would obsolete the Mandrake, and it 100% does. The Ra1 Heather fires 5 rockets over great distance. Each rocket does 140 damage on a direct hit. This means that if it fires 5 of them, that means it does the exact same damage as the Avalanche, 700, except more of the damage is blast than direct. Actually, 100% of the damage is blast, instead of it being split between bullet and blast. The other thing is the Ra1 Heather's perk says that the faster you move, the faster it reloads, which means that it favors a hit-and-run playstyle, which is what you would have normally done anyway with an artillery piece, such as. But in this instance, you're being actually paid for it. The Ra1 Heather is a phenomenal weapon. It is actually used in significant sum of places, and unlike the Mandrake, being hit by the Heather is a death sentence to just about every build that I have seen so far. Most people rock 2 Heathers, and if you're only using 1 Heather, it means you're farming lower power to score, which means they don't have the durability to survive 1 Heather hit anyway. The Heather is just good. It's just phenomenal. It is a death sentencey weapon that is actually encroaching on Scorpion territory. What I mean by that is Scorpions are a very long-range weapon that you try and punch very precise holes into your opponent. The Heather is a very long-range weapon where you try to remove your opponent from the game instantly. And if they don't move, it's just a death sentence. I used the Heather in just a few matches just to see how it was. And unlike the Mandrake, which took me, I don't know, you get 1 kill. Well, for me personally, because I'm not very good with Mandrake, but for me personally, you could get 1 kill every like 6 matches or so with the Mandrake. Heather, you come out with 4 or 5 kills a match. It's not even close to fair. Hitting anyone even remotely close to them is going to remove their weapons. It's going to remove their armor, their equipment. It's going to splash into their high explosives. Obviously, you use this with the Harpy Cabin. Heather is just remarkably oppressive. I don't know what could be done to bring the Heather down into a more reasonable position, but for right now, I'm going to put it into A tier with the Miller. It's really, really good. Is it an S tier weapon? Crap. This is one of those weird situations where I think actually the Ra1 Heather is S tier. It's got counters, but that doesn't matter. I think it's an S tier weapon, actually, now that I'm doing the... Sorry for doing this live and in person chat, but it is an S tier weapon. It works in Clan Wars. It works in standard battles. It works wherever you take it. You can drag it into low power score just like you can with other Seal Club-esque weapons. There are people who are using the Heather to farm low power scores by simply having a Heather in a cabin. Yeah, no, actually, yeah, it's S tier. It is an annoying weapon. It is a threat in every single power score bracket. You have to make a concerted effort to hunt down the person who's using the Heathers, because if you don't, they will end you. It is remarkably annoying. Actually, I'm going to put it in A tier, because everything you can say about the Heather, you can say about the Retcher. You have to end that person who's using it, and there is a counter to it, which is getting close and removed. But it is borderline S tier BS. Heather is very good, but we're going to leave it in A tier. But just barely. It's just very, very brutal. All right, so let's go over other weapons that have already existed on this tier list that you can see barely at the bottom of the screen that I now need to replace because of the fact that changes have been done. So from here on out, these are weapons that have already existed in the meta. We have the M37 Piercer. Piercer originally appeared on this list at B tier above its supposed upgrade, the Fidget. But recently they nerfed it. They nerfed the Piercer by making it overheat faster, so you have to, well, you can't fire as long, and also has lower durability. However, in all the power scores that it's brought to and all the current builds that it's currently in, it still goes right on back to B tier. The change that they did to the Piercer doesn't nerf it enough to remove it from where it was, but it's close. Like, they made it a little bit more fragile, but you're still going to mount it on the tops of your builds in a straight line pattern. You're still going to do drive-bys. It's still going to clap. It still has very high DPS. Next up is the Boar. They had prospected changes where they were going to reduce the durability even further from what it was to, air quotes, give even more counterplay. But they actually didn't do that. They actually nerfed its impact damage. So for those of us, collision damage, initial collision damage. So the reason why I said impact damage is because all damage it deals is, air quotes, collision. It's always melee. But the damage that weapons deal on impact, which is to say the damage that's transferred when you collide with your opponent, has been reduced by what they say is 2 times, which means that it now does 1/3 of the collision damage. So the reason why they're making this change is because the Boar is used in very low power scores, 4K minus. And the reason why it works, as I've said many times before, is because of the fact that you're fighting opponents that don't have bumpers. It drops off immediately and also prevents other weapons such as the Lacerator and the Mauler from coming into prevalence, is because by the time you reach the power scores that those weapons would normally dominate, opponents actually have bumpers. And the reason why the Harvester ranks A tier is because by the time you get to such a high power score, people don't use bumpers anymore. So there's this weird power score bracket between 5K and somewhere in the neighborhood of 11K where people are just covered in bumpers. And because of that, it makes melee weapons less effective. But before that, before 5K, so you're looking at 4K minus, you got the Boar sitting pretty, just tearing through people. So the nerf that they applied to it is made it so you're not supposed to be able to crash right through whatever little bumpers they have, because again, the little bumpers that you have are most likely going to be from the engineer factions at that point, or maybe the lunatics factions, and the bullet bar isn't exactly going to stop a trucker cabin melee build from instantaneously puncturing right through it and hitting you directly in your frame. The problem is the boar still does exactly what it did before. Once you get through their bumpers, which you will do in a very short order, you're still going to end up grinding right off their frame right off. They're going to end up, you know, on the ground, just a detached cabin. The boar is still just as strong as it has been before. So it goes from B tier back to B tier. Next up, we have the median. For those of us who do not remember, the median originally came in at C tier. It is the earliest sniper weapon that you can get, lowest rarity sniper weapon in the game. But the problem with the median, it was a shotgun. It's very inaccurate. They fixed that. They said, all right, movement spread while moving reduced, everything reduced, and they brought it all down. So now the median is an actual sniper weapon that can actually be used on hovers at actual low tier, and for that reason it is now bumped up to B tier. Originally it came in at C tier because of the fact that it was a sniper weapon that you couldn't use on sniper platforms. Like, it was just very inaccurate. Now they fixed the accuracy problem back. So good job, median. Good buff. Next up is the Varan. The Varan was placed originally in B tier in the blind, and many of the problems that the Varan had, they actually fixed. They buffed it. They front-loaded much of its power while reducing the efficacy of the perk. So the high-end fully stacked perks are exactly the same as it was before. The weapon hasn't changed at all in that regard, but the amount of damage it does before you ramp up the perk, as well as what you need to do to maintain the perk, have been improved. So originally it was B tier. Right now, after like a bunch of conversations in chat, a bunch of people commenting on my videos and all that good stuff like that, yeah, the Varan has warranted itself to barely come up to A tier, barely. Varan is a pretty good gun. It still has the very one pin diameter weapons or projectiles, but thanks to its buff, it probably is now warranting a higher tier because of the fact that it is more reliable. So before, it's a negative press weapon. You have to charge up to fire it. For those of us who don't know, the perk increases the projectile velocity and damage of the bolt as you fire it. You don't even have to successfully hit. You just have to fire it. So with that, the perk now not mattering as much and it becoming more easily used, we're going to give it A tier. Next up, we have the Phoenix. The Phoenix crossbow was the very first C tier weapon on this tier list. For those of us who do not know, the Phoenix is another crossbow with a. The idea is that you fire explosive bolts, they attach to your opponent, and they explode. They cut the time by 25% that the explosive bolt has to maintain on the target before it explodes. It took off 1 second, or it was originally 4, 3. And they increased the durability of the bolt from 10. I didn't even know it had 10 durability. I thought it had 1 to 35. So that's a what is that? 350% increase to the durability of the bolt. Now it's funny when you talk with percentages, it makes it sound really large. But 35 damage is not very much. So it does, however, make the bullets harder to remove. Those are all well and good, but that doesn't change the fact that the Phoenix competes directly with cannons, and in reality, cannons do not need to wait for their damage. They land their shot, they get their damage, whereas the Phoenix, you still have a chance of counterplay. It's still kind of brutal to use, though they did increase the Phoenix's durability as well, the actual crossbow launchers. It's still going to come into C tier. It's really niche. You can get kills, but you have to guard. Next up is the Yokai. Yokai originally appeared on my tier list at D tier. The reason why I put it at D tier is because it's a weapon that is designed that you are designed to not hit your opponent. That is the definition of niche. However, I've received messages from people saying that they can get damage with it, they can get kills with it, they're the bane of hovers and so on and so forth. So with all of that said and done, you can get kills with the Yokai, and you can do it more or less reliably. Well, not necessarily reliably, but you have to work really hard to get those kills. But that is the definition of C tier, so it's coming up from D to C tier. Well done, Yokai, well done. Even though it's a weapon that you're trying to miss with. I don't know. I don't know. Next up is the Mandrake. The Mandrake received a buff in the dark. And the reason why it received a buff in the dark was because of the release of the Heather. The Heather was a phenomenal, is a phenomenal artillery piece. And so the devs decided to look back on the Mandrake and be like, you know what, we're going to buff it. And they did. One of the things that they buffed was the accuracy of the initial shot is dramatically increased, according to what they said. That those are their words. There's no percentage I can give that can explain it. But it is more likely that you're going to be able to hit a stationary target if you yourself are stationary while firing with the Mandrake. It is not guaranteed, but it is more likely, dramatically more likely. Additionally, the raining projectiles also have a greater likelihood of hitting. And then in addition to that, the fire puddle duration and radius were increased. So the idea is the Mandrake will be able to deny area slightly better. With all of those things said, the Mandrake is still going directly back into D tier. The reason why it's going back into D tier is because it's bad. It is still terrible. The fire puddles the Mandrake leaves behind are not comparable to incinerator fire puddles. They do not set you to instantly 100% overheated. In addition to that, the damage is fine, but it's inaccurate. The sheer fact that you fire 5 shots and may hit with one of them versus the versus the Heather where you fire 5 shots and you will hit with all of them, it keeps the Mandrake completely and totally obsoleted. It's just an obsolete weapon in this day and age. So it's going to go back into D tier regardless of the changes that came down to it. They're simply not good enough. Also, for those of us who do not know, the time it takes to charge and fire the Mandrake, because it is a negative press weapon, is actually longer than that of the Heather. It's just worse. Objectively worse. The Mandrake really needs to have its horizontal angles brought back so that you can basically fire directly at your opponent. That's basically where we're going to right now anyway in Crossout. I mean, with the power of the Avalanche and so on and so forth. But that's neither here nor there. Next up, we have the Waltz. The Waltz received a leveling of the playing field. So for many people that own the Waltz, you own it because you had got it in the Battle Pass. For many people who built the Waltz, they didn't get it in the Battle Pass. The Battle Pass fused. Waltzes are fused for projectile velocity, and that alone is the only thing that really matters. The projectile fused Waltzes, according to Gaijin, met what they expected. They handled appropriately. They reached the target they were looking for. But when the Waltz was built without fusion, they were a complete hot ass. So what they did is they nerfed the Waltz. They just made a slight change, making it so the projectile velocity of the Waltz from the fusion is less impactful by increasing the base projectile velocity of the Waltz itself, but reducing the percentage gained by the fusion. This is a solid buff, a flat buff for anyone who's wondering. It's like, did they nerf my Waltz? No, they didn't. The projectile is now actually 1% faster than it was for those of us who had the Waltzes fused before, but 16% faster or so for those people who, 15% faster or so for those people who had the Waltz prior and didn't have it fused. The Waltz originally came in at this on this tier list at C. And the reason why is because it's a spinning whirligig rocket that you cannot predict its trajectory, and you have to predict the future while among predicting the future, and that has not changed. So it's going right back to C tier. It can get kills. You can kill with it. Great job. Thumbs up. But it's still bad. It's a weapon that you cannot control where it goes, and that's a problem. But glad to see the buffs. Next up is the Summoner and the Argument. Summoner and Argument both showed up on this list at C tier before. In reality, the reason why was because of the fact that at point blank range, you're dealing with real shotguns, and real shotguns pose a real threat. The change that came to the Summoner and Argument, if I recall correctly, they improved the precision of single tap fire. So if you want to tap fire the Summoner and Argument, now the projectile is more accurate. That's neat. If I recall correctly, they also removed the spread while moving. So removed it outright. So that means that if you're moving and you decide to aim down sights, charge up and fire, you're just going to have more accurate projectiles. So these changes are actually remarkably good. I've had a chance to play Summoner and Argument after these changes, though the weapon still feels almost exactly the same as it did before. You do have more tightly grouped shots, even while moving, and so on and so forth. So with that said, Summoner and Argument are still going to go into C tier. It's like, well, why didn't this change? It sounds like I'm just putting these things right back where they came from. And the reason why is because I am. Summoner and Argument are better off than they were before, don't get me wrong. But in reality, you're not going to tap fire these guns. Yeah, I've very, 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 very rarely ever done it. And that's not the draw of the Summoner and the Argument. The Summoner and the Argument's draw is the fact that you can basically have a ranged shotgun that doesn't have damage drop-off. Again, the pro tip to using these weapons, the Summoner Argument, is that you charge it to halfway and fire. You're going to fire around 4 bolts per, and it's going to be very tightly clustered regardless. Give it a try. They're actually remarkably good, but even though they're remarkably good, they still only come up C tier because they're not going to directly compete necessarily against what you want them to compete against, which would be, you know, shotguns, things like the Fafnir and the Junk Bow. They just fall off in comparison because if you do get that close, they're going to beat you. And if you're using summoners and arguments at long range, you're going to be up against long range weapons. Long range weapons, dedicated long range weapons, are definitely going to put you down. Next up is a buff, flat buff to the Prosecutor. Prosecutor used to be at B tier. The buff to the Prosecutor just simply increases its damage straight up. More bullet damage, more blast damage. Why would they do this? I don't know. The Prosecutor was already really good. The change to the Prosecutor probably is coming in because of the tanky meta, because we are all getting more tanky thanks to Grizzly. We're getting more tanky thanks to the Omomori, things like that. It's an interesting change, to be sure. Originally, the Prosecutor came, as I said, on this list at Bravo, B tier. I think that it's still the same, honestly. The change wasn't big enough to change its tier, but it kept it where it was, I guess. Similarly, the Executioner 88mm was changed. They only increased the bullet damage on the Executioner. I don't know why. Originally, the Executioner came in at C tier. In reality, it's just a slower firing Prosecutor because the Prosecutor and the Executioner share a perk now. And the Prosecutor's damage, even though it is less than the Executioner, is irrelevant because you're just crit seeking with either weapon. You're just trying to hit a generator. And once you do, a generator or fuel, and then once you do, they just explode instantaneously. The Executioner just simply has a slower reload time, and its damage isn't consummate for that. And even after they buffed it, they just buffed the bullet damage. They didn't buff the explosive damage, which is what ties to the Executioner's perk. So it's a bit quizzical. I'll take any buff I can get on the Executioner. It is my favorite cannon in the game. However, it's still going to end up back into C tier. Last thing was the Qriket. The buff to the Qriket, they just increased its blast radius. They did this because they're thinking that people aren't using it enough. Whatever. In reality, the Qriket does about 1,000 damage with all of its rockets. It's decent. And originally I gave it B tier on this list. The additional blast damage isn't enough to take it out of B tier. I know that sounds sad, like silly, because I went to the trouble of going over all of these weapons and putting them basically right back into the tier that they're in despite their change. But there's a reason. The Qriket's, to change the Qriket's tier, you need to change its refire rate. That's plain and simple. The Qriket's refire rate just needs to be buffed. This is very similar to other weapons on this list, such as the Locust or the Wasp. The Wasp, the Locust, and I believe it's the Pyramid, all of those weapons have a very, very fast refire rate between the rockets. It's 1-2. Whereas the Qriket has a spaced between, much larger space between each rocket that was launched. And that was the nerf. That was the nerf that they put on to the Qriket to drag it out of S tier. Because it was in S tier. It was like one of the best, if not the best weapon in the entire game. And it got dragged out of S tier because of the fact they made it take so long between each individual rocket on the Qriket. So, and that brought it down to B tier, increasing its blast radius. I mean, that's not really going to change where it sits, because what keeps it down is the fact that it's got no durability, it has horrible hitbox, can't be protected very well, and the fact that you have to stay exposed so long when you fire it. So that's my update. I'm sorry, I'm sorry for stuttering as much as I did, stammering my way through this. I hope you guys agree with the changes. I hope you guys appreciate that I've gone back through, listened to your complaints about the positioning of certain weapons, such as the Yokai on this list. Also updating things such as bringing the... Oh, wait, did I not do that? One of the things that I forgot to update on this, sorry, I'll do it right now, is the Breaker. The Breaker is coming down from A to B tier for consistency. One of the things that I mentioned when if you go back and notice my previous tier list, I go to the trouble of explaining the Breaker, etc., and I said that it's actually difficult to drag out of certain power scores, and it is. It's difficult to drag it down, and that is actually quintessential B tier, which is where the Firebug sits, and I put it in A tier. That was my bad. So, there we go. That's the end of my tier list. Sorry about that last second change. I hope you guys enjoy. Yeah. Peace.